The Russians massively outnumber the Ukrainians, and they have a lot more men to lose, and they have a lot higher tolerance for casualties. So the 2 or 3 to 1 ratio that the Ukrainians have been inflicting on the Russians in terms of casualty ratios is wildly insufficient if the Ukrainians are going to win. They need to achieve a series of mass fatality events that kills at least minimum 500,000 Russian troops in a very short period of time. That is very difficult to do. They also, because of the numbers disconnect, can only win if they win on quality and, above all, mobility. And they haven't been able to do that this winter because it has been freakishly warm in Ukraine all winter. The ground never froze solid. It's still about 40 degrees today on the 1st of February in Kiev. And that means that all of the fields are not frozen solid, they're mud. And the Ukrainians can't maneuver in the mud, so they can't use their superior mobility in order to encircle, cut off, and dice up the Russian troops. This is buying the Russians times to reinforce. They've started a second, what's the word I'm looking for here, mobilization. And by the time we get to May 1, which will be spring and mud season will be over, the Ukrainians will have more troops with more training and better equipment, but the Russians will have thrown an extra 500,000 men into the fight. So we're going to find out very, very soon, certainly before the end of June, which of these battle strategies is going to be more effective. And the numbers absolutely favor the Russians. Because remember, unless the Ukrainians can inflict 8 to 1 casualty ratios, they still lose. But if they can pull that off and completely break Russian military power, then it's game on. We will know by mid-June just who's going to win this war. Now, step 2, the impact that this has on all those economic issues you were bringing up. The Russians are a major producer or processor of any number of industrial and agricultural materials that just don't have good substitutes anywhere. On the agricultural front, potash is the most important one. In terms of industry, I'd say chromium and nickel are probably near the top because you can't make steel without them. All of this stuff has been maintained, all this infrastructure has been maintained not by the Russians, but by Westerners who are no longer there. A lot of the industrial infrastructure dates back to the 60s, and we are already seeing industrial accidents that are so big that they can't be seen from orbit. They can be detected from orbit because the explosions are so big. It's happening in energy and natural gas, it's happening in agricultural production, it's happening in chemicals. So whether it happens in 3 months or 3 years, we need to count on most of the industrial materials that the Russians send to the rest of the world going away, regardless of who wins this war. And that makes a lot of things very difficult for a lot of other players.
Because the global boycott, if you will, the sanctions will maintain in perpetuity regardless of who wins this war?
I think that's safe, but the Russians are losing the ability to produce it anyway. So even if you're willing to go around the sanctions, and a lot of these products like, say, nickel or potash, they're not under sanction. It's just people refusing to use them. And now they're going away. Fertilizer output from the Russian space is already down by 20 to 40%, which depending on which nutrient you're looking at. This is something the world is not ready for. If we really are going to reindustrialize the United States, we need a lot of steel. If we are really going to electrify everything, we need 4 times as much nickel and 10 times as much lithium. We can't do that normally. We've never, as a species, been able to double the volume of any material that we were already had in use within a decade, and we have to do it for 14 things for the Green Everything program. And we're going to now do it without the Russians. So we are looking at significant corporate breaks in terms of the supply for a lot of basic materials. The ones I'm most concerned about by far are those fertilizer materials. We were very lucky in 2022. Farmers the world over had great weather, and everyone had a backup fertilizer supply in their back pocket. That's gone, and Mother Nature is never that nice 2 years in a row. So this is probably the beginning of a significant year of food shortages on top of the industrial shortages. You remember that first week of the war when that giant convoy was moving south from Belarus to Kiev, and we thought it was all over on like day 2. And then on day 4, it stopped because they forgot fuel. And on day 7, all the soldiers walked back to Belarus because they also forgot food. Everyone I know in NATO kind of came to the same conclusion, that the Russians don't know how to fight. It's not that they've forgotten the lessons of the Soviet period, they've forgotten the lessons of the Tsar. They're almost starting from scratch. And if you put NATO up against the Russians directly, you're going to get 1,000-to-1 casualty ratios. And that made no one happy, because if the Russians can win in Ukraine, we know they're coming for Poland and Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania and Romania, and those are NATO countries.
But
and
they're
then we will
not.
have that
They're
direct
not coming
clash.
across those countries. NATO isn't going to allow that. Ukraine's
Right.
not a NATO member.
But if we get that, if Ukraine loses and we get that head-to-head Russian-NATO fight, we know we will wipe the floor with them. But the Russians see this as a fight for their existential existence. And they will use every card they have. There have not been protests in Russia, not just because the propaganda has dug into the Russians.
He has more support than the West thinks he does.
A lot more. There's not a challenge to him from within. And if you think back to the first mobilization, 1 million men fled the country. There were no protests. The Russians are broadly in favor of the war. They would just prefer not to fight in it. 3/4 of global agricultural shipments, manufacturing supply chain steps, and energy shipments travel the ocean blue, and 2/3 of all of those shipments travel the ocean blue in East Asia. Without freedom of the seas, the global system as we understand it doesn't just die, it just has no possibility of existing. And you are talking then about not just mass famine, but the mass deindustrialization of large portions of the planet, with China being first in line. We don't see the Cold War as this overwhelming threat anymore. Even with the Russians being back on the warpath in Ukraine, that hasn't changed American minds on globalization. If anything, it's reinforced it. Because if you look at all the deals that the Russians are cutting, if you look at all the deals that the Americans are cutting with the Japanese, the Europeans, and everyone else on the war, every single one of them is 100% purely security. None of them are guns for butter deals where there's some sort of Bretton Woods or Globalization 2 on offer. In fact, every trade tariff, every trade war that Donald Trump initiated, the Biden administration has doubled and tripled down on, except for one out of over 80. We're done. And if we're done, we are honestly just kind of marking time until something in this system breaks. The Ukraine war very well could be that thing.
Has anyone ever called you an alarmist?
Usually they're not that kind.
Are you an alarmist?
I like to think I'm a realist. We've been living in this wonderful period since 1945, where the Americans created globalization as a way of inducing allies to join the cause against the Soviets, and it worked. But never forget that for the United States, this was never an economic plan. It was a security play, and it worked. But that made everyone's economies dependent upon how the Americans view their own security. And after 1992, our view of our security has changed.